You're listening to This Week in Urbanism from Missouri Metro. I'm your host, Brian Adler, and This Week in Urbanism is designed to bring you up to speed on the latest in urban developments, infrastructure, policy, politics, rumors, and more that influence the urban experience in St. Louis. So stick around and subscribe so you don't miss the Friday morning shows as we take you on a journey showing how St. Louis is moving forward. If you want to listen a little early, check out our Patreon supporter page at patreon.com/Brian Adler to support this podcast. And of course, if you haven't noticed, this is my first podcast that I'm doing on camera. You'll be able to stream this podcast watching me make funny expressions over at our Missouri Metro YouTube page or on the Missouri Metro website, where we'll have a post specifically for this podcast. Today is April 8th, 2022. And today we are going to talk about some particularly bad urban and environmental policy. And to do so, we are going to shift our focus back toward the West Coast, which, as you have maybe noticed before, I use as my personal urbanism punching bag. And to be fair to California, I want to say here early on that not every bit of this particular policy I'm going to talk about is bad. Just most of it. And it shows how colossally screwed up our priorities are and that our leaders have, even the liberal ones, who you might often assume would be more allied with urbanist causes because of their direct links often to active lifestyles, diversity, environmentalism, and more. Anyway, on March 23rd, California Governor Gavin Newsom released a press release. And it's a bad press release. Most of all, it seems political and doesn't actually do us, in my view, a whole lot of good. Here's what's happening. The California governor announced that he would seek to use $11 billion in unused American Rescue Plan funding, which comes from the federal government, to say, ease the burden on commuters across the state of California. The biggest chunk of this money, totaling a little over $9 billion, would be distributed to car owners across the state. And how will that money be distributed? Well, that's a good question, but it's actually pretty simple, actually. Each individual car owner could receive $400 for each car in their name, up to 2 cars per individual. That means, seemingly, if you're a couple or have multiple family members, you could have 4, maybe 6 or 8 cars in a given family. And as long as each of you have 2 in your name and no more, you're going to get a whole lot of money. So again, the money's not per person, it's per car. And that's interesting, right? That means that 9 out of every $11 spent on this program goes to car owners, even allowing double counting for benefits of this program. A single individual might receive $800 if they have 2 cars in their name. Speaking of double counting, that same individual who might receive $800 might see a host of other benefits too. The other $2 billion isn't simply just going to pedestrians, bikers, and transit users. And actually, let's quickly go over that breakdown. We're going to see $750 million for grants for transit and rail agencies to provide free transit for 3 months. The order states that roughly 3 million transit users per day will see that benefit. About $600 million will pause some of the diesel sales taxes for the year. Again, that's a fossil fuel. About $520 million will go toward pausing the inflationary adjustment to gas and diesel taxes for the year, but it doesn't stop inflation for areas that other consumers might be using. Finally, $500 million will go toward pedestrian and bike projects. And the plan also includes an additional $1.75 billion toward charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. So, that family getting checks that subsidize their car usage will also see their bills at the pump subsidized as well. And let's be clear, subsidized by all residents of California, even those who aren't using cars. When push comes to shove, we're really only looking at a smidgen over $1 billion toward pedestrians, bikers, and transit, which, of course, car users could theoretically choose to support and utilize too. Rather, even electric vehicle infrastructure gets more funding than actually environmentally conscious solutions. So let's get real for a second here, as if we weren't already. Most of this funding is a slap in the face for environmental advocates, pedestrians, and transit users. Rather than incentivizing improved transit access, frequency, better routes, etc., we're going to see a short fare subsidy. If you thought maybe perhaps that this program was lopsided toward cars, you're going to love this. I looked at the LA Metro website, and the 30-day passes that are currently for sale are going for $50, right? So that means free fares for 3 months would only save an individual $150. And that's not insignificant in real terms, but it is insignificant when compared to the fact that a single car owner might receive $800 if they own 2 vehicles. And then on top of that, they will also have their gas itself subsidized. I can't exactly tell what's going on perfectly with the LA Metro's fares, but it does seem like they're already half off normal pricing for some reason. So let's be fair, right? Let's double the fares. Even then, we get $300 for 3 months, which isn't the actual price right now, but even if it was, that's still a substantial amount less than what an individual car user could be getting. Better yet, none of these funds going toward transit are investments in long-term solutions. Rather, instead of investing in more transit routes, train or bus frequencies, or anything else that riders might expect to enjoy in the long term, this is just a short-term pocketbook adjustment that will simply disappear without really much to show for itself thereafter. Even if they were looking to do real transit improvement, we must also realize that $1 billion would hardly be enough for a simple new transit line in a city like St. Louis that's currently exploring a north-south Metrolink improvement. Let's throw in LA property and labor prices, and we can begin to see how, even if this were invested in a longer-term outlook, it wouldn't do us very much good, not in St. Louis and certainly not in California, where things cost way, way, way more generally. Okay, so what about the $500 million in pedestrian and bike infrastructure across the state? And actually, I like that. I wish there were a whole lot more of that. The unfortunate truth that we're talking about here is that a few major bike trails at best can be completed with this amount of money. For reference, Los Angeles is currently working on a 32-mile bike path along the LA River that it has, believe it or not, been working on for the last 25 years. And let's not even go into how much quicker the region completes roadways. And anyways, I digress. Los Angeles itself is ponying up $15 million for this project, but requesting, wait for it, at least $197 million from the California state government. So we're looking at over $200 million for this one project along the LA River in the entire state of California. That's over $6 million per mile. And while that might sound crazy, consider that even here in St. Louis, the Tower Grove Connector project with protected bike paths will cost just over $9 million, and that's for 1.4 miles. So it's a pretty similar price per mile, but in fairness to St. Louis, since I think I could get called on this, the Tower Grove Connector project is doing intersection work, sidewalk improvements, repaving the actual road, and traffic signal improvements. So it's not a very fair comparison. The Tower Grove Connector project might be doing more, but we're still looking at a pretty expensive cost per mile. Anyway, the point is that maybe, just maybe, you could complete 2 or 2.5 major projects in California, which has around 40 million people, with this money. So we're talking maybe 100 miles or less of bike paths at that current cost, and no actual transit infrastructure improvements. So how and why would we expect anyone with this money to really change their habits toward healthier and more environmentally friendly forms of transportation? Then consider the incentives headed in the opposite direction. For all of California's talk about wanting to become a green state, only a small fraction of these dollars is actually going toward electric car vehicle charging and infrastructure. And as we know, there are still a host of severe problems with electric cars and the environment. As we've discussed before, we don't have enough lithium mines or the low-wage workers across the globe to fulfill the demand for the amount of cars that exist today if they were all electric. Our roadways aren't prepared for the extra weight of these battery-studded vehicles, and our recycling programs can hardly handle plastic. And now you expect them to handle these toxic chemical byproducts of lithium? It's all nonsense. that we feed ourselves so we can blindly continue our habits, simply assuming that someone else is taking care of these negative externalities we're causing. There's a whole thing called wish cycling, which goes on about how when we throw something in the recycling bin, we're just really wishing that it gets taken care of. But in this case, unfortunately, our infrastructure doesn't exist and won't feasibly exist without significant investments for electric cars. Regardless, the main beneficiary of this program is the oil industry and our dependency on gas vehicles. At a time when gas prices are the highest, we could have leveraged this toward momentum on revolutionary projects with transit. We could have induced demand toward better solutions. Rather, we coddled everyone. We let them know that it's okay to keep driving an F-150 or two. We say we're investing in alternatives, even though those investments amount to little more than a few miles of infrastructure at best. We subsidize them 2 ways over even. We pay them excessive and disproportionate amounts of money to cover what they're paying at the pump, and then when they get to that pump, we subsidize them again. I don't think I have the time or the research with me right now to talk about the impact on various socioeconomic classes here, but I do want you to consider this. A family with multiple SUVs is likely to be making more than someone riding the bus to work. Not necessarily, but likely. Who benefits the most from this scenario? Obviously, those with more assets. That's not to say that they don't need the help. Probably a lot of people are having a hard time. But who are we really helping here? Are Californians' dollars really being spent in a way that we can be proud of? Well, as a former Californian, my answer is no, definitely not. But this is a case study that we should all be aware of across the country. Here in Missouri, our legislators don't even like electric vehicles, but for the wrong reasons. It's not that they realize they're just a false panacea. No, they simply don't believe in climate change. And obviously that's, well, probably worse in some ways. But it's also just delusional, just in a different way. Other states might see this allocation of funds in California and want to do something similar. And the point is that even if they have better goals, or better wishes essentially, that they care about climate change, this is still the wrong path to go down. So this week in Urbanism, I'm hoping you'll see how some dollars that we allocate are really little more than an illusion. We need to demand more of our dollars and our legislators in every state, and also simply not rest assured that electing someone who says they care about climate change will actually lead to decent and different climate policy. The status quo is strong and entrenched, and we seem to keep digging those trenches deeper, ignoring what we already know works. Okay, so this isn't as optimistic as last week's podcast, I recognize that, but this is important. Here in St. Louis, as we're about to allocate historic amounts of federal money, let's be careful and let's spend it on long-term solutions, and let's do it knowing what we're trying to accomplish here. We have a real opportunity, and we can't, or at least we shouldn't, squander it on feel-good, short-term subsidies that fuel harmful industries and habits while saying we're doing just the opposite. So let's not kid ourselves. Until then, St. Louis, have a great day. And to the rest of the country, we are here in the middle, finding our place in the 21st century. Get ready.